you have written a lot on code speech and political speech and argued basically that when politicians will use coded speech, it does not mean that they are using words that have implicit meanings encoded in them that refer to any like different groups of people than the meaning of the word might imply or entail.
Yeah.
Rather that code speech relies upon the inferences that audience members draw when we listen to speech. So when Trump says something like, if we let Obama win the election, our cities will become inner city wrecks, or our suburbs will become inner city wrecks. This is not like implicitly saying anything about the racial makeup of inner city or suburbs, but rather relying upon, or you call actually, you say exploiting our inferential capability
Yeah.
to basically make a very racist claim. And then later, I do want to ask about like maybe we're moving away from using code
Yeah.
speech because Elon Musk did recently just do a Nazi salute, and I
Yeah.
feel like I hear Trump call women pigs and all kinds of things all the time.
Yeah.
And that's not really coded as far as I personally can tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good, great. I mean, great question, and you totally have my view exactly right. But I'm going to back up slightly. So here's with when it comes to coded speech, the thing that I think is uh, sort of useful to sort of think about in sort of situating this is why this even arises. So first of all, what is coded speech and why is it arising? So here's how I'll tell the story. Um, suppose you're a politician and you're making a speech to a bunch of people, and then all political speech is sort of multi-audience in the sense that you're never just it's not just one-on-one. You're talking to a big group of people, I perhaps through social media or when you're actually at a rally or whatever. Um, now, the makeup of that audience is diverse. So there's going to be some people who have certain views and other people have other views. You're in a kind of high stakes situation because you're trying to everything you say is going to resonate differently with those different people, and your aim as a politician is to get those people to vote for you. So you now are faced with a dilemma because, on the one hand, suppose you want to show half of the audience that you support some policy, but at the same time, you don't want to alienate the other half of the audience that totally disagrees with that policy and thinks people that support that policy are racist or something like that. So what do you do? And coded speech is a way of managing that problem. So, um, the classic example, which you mentioned, that a lot of people have worked who sort of worked in this recently, I've been focused on is inner city, and there, again, the language changes fast. So it may be that when we were writing about this stuff, not even 10 years ago, now it's completely different. But at the time, at least, and I think a little bit before then, politicians would use sort of inner city. So what does inner city mean? Well, if you look at the dictionary definition, it just means something like a densely populated urban core, basically a center part of the city that's highly populated. That's the dictionary definition. You won't see in dictionary definitions, although maybe that has been updated, you won't see that it's used as a synonym for black or minority people. Now, though, what has happened is that these politicians will often sort of use inner city in place of black or minority. So Paul Ryan's sort of the famous sort of thing he said was we have like a culture problem of laziness in our inner cities, people not working and all that. And on the one hand, we kind of all know what he's trying to get at. He's trying to basically communicate black people are lazy or whatever, something to that effect. Um, but he didn't come out and explicitly say this. And when he was called out on it, he was able to just say, "Oh, I'm not talking about black people. I'm talking about uh, urban. Well, that is like coded, but like I'm talking about like densely populated." City problems. I'm talking about stuff in the cities and as opposed to the suburbs. And now, whether he can get away with that is maybe we might think, well, that's crazy. Like, that's obviously wrong. But for a long time, politicians were able to do that. I mean, these things were sort of, there was enough wiggle room in there for them to just say that. And as long as enough people who are listening to Paul Ryan can be like, yeah, that seems reasonable. I'll go ahead and vote for this, or it provides them cover for being able to sort of vote for a policy that it would maybe be explicitly racist, but do so without sort of feeling themselves like they're voting for a racist policy or telling their neighbors they're voting for a racist policy, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this is a way of sort of capturing what everything you want as a politician from your audience, right? You want to signal to the people who are maybe explicitly racist or whatever that you're going to support their policies, while at the same time not alienating those people who would if you just said black people are lazy, they would say, "Oh, I can't vote for you." Okay, okay. Now the theoretical question for the philosopher of language slash linguist is, how does the code word do this? So it's got to have something to do with the meaning of inner city, that it just allows for this kind of deniability. Whereas if Paul Ryan had come out and said, black people are lazy, but black people are not lazy, that would have just been an explicit contradiction. And so he can't, get away with it in the way that maybe he can with inner city. And so anyway, that's the sort of theoretical debate, and that's where my position comes in. Where if you're thinking analytic synthetic, I'm thinking the thing with inner city is that it's exploiting our kind of general inference about, well, in the areas that people talk about in the inner city, what is the racial makeup of those areas tends to be like. We have stereotypes about that. Those get activated, and so then we infer from that plus what they said, we just infer the thing that they want us to infer, although they didn't say it. They kind of like led us to make that inference, even though they didn't say it. And that's how they can then deny being racist or whatever, because they're like, you drew the inference, not me.
But
And in
also the
fact,
history
that's,
of redlining. I mean, like,
yeah. Well, yeah. So
yeah,
no, totally. I mean, there's a reason for why this is the way it is.
yeah.
Yeah. But in fact, that's what Paul Ryan said when he was called out on it. He was like, "You're the one making this about race," and I think that's so interesting that you know it's that sort of turning the tables move that he obviously couldn't do if he had just said the explicitly racist thing. So anyway, it just affords them that kind of wiggle room that I think is it's sneaky, but it's also the kind of thing that, and this maybe is just going to set up your next question, but I do think this is the kind of thing that a lot of people are aware of at some level, and and have become more aware of in the last 20 years. And basically because of the internet, I think it makes it a lot easier for this kind of information to be sort of shared widely. And so as a result, coded speech it has to morph and change in various ways, because if everybody just assumes, if you're talking about the inner city, you're trying to say something about basically about black people or minorities, then it ceases to function as a code word because the deniability will be less, right? So anyway, but I think this is kind of potentially where we are now, is that some of these code words have become calcified and maybe are changing their meanings in some ways, in which case the dictionary eventually should write, synonym for minorities or whatever. And I don't know if we're there yet, but it depends on who you talk to, and this is where the sort of the sociolinguistic aspect of it is interesting. The language is changing, but it's changing in differentially, like it's changing in different places at different times and so on. So yeah.
Yeah. And then kind of more recently, I just don't really feel like I hear a ton of coded speech anymore. I feel like people are
Yeah.
just kind of saying what they mean, particularly Trump now. I mean, he just kind of
Yeah.
says things that are semantically and pragmatically aligned. And that is very shocking to us. And then we kind of become desensitized to it. But I mean, why would a particular ideological faction move away from using coded speech? Like, what, like,
Yeah.
I think it's a pretty clear signal to just like do a Nazi silly. Like
Yeah.
that's a pretty clear like semiotic
Yeah.
resource.
Let's first talk about sort of the rise of Trump and the kind of the rise of speech that is just sort of explicitly and overtly violating the kinds of social norms that previously had been, people had used coded speech to kind of get around. So there's this interesting article. It was written in the New York Times op-ed piece, op-ed section that used to have a philosophy section, actually, called "The Stone," and written by Jason Stanley in 2015. Now, Jason Stanley is someone I whose work on coded speech and propaganda, it was really inspiring to my own, and I do admire a lot of what Jason is doing, and I think this is a really wonderful piece because um, so Jason in that piece notes he's like he I basically asked this question. He's like, well, why is Trump just coming out and saying all this explicitly racist stuff when he's like declaring his campaign and all that? And he hypothesized that actually this gets Trump something that is kind of unexpected from the perspective that we've been in so far, which is that, but it makes sense when you think of it in retrospect. So in the situation where Trump's doing this, you have all these politicians. Now, this is a very different world, right? 10 years ago, where all the politicians, Republican, Democrat, are all speaking in code. They're saying they're all kind of like, you know, hiding their kind of true intentions. And as a result, a lot of people naturally think of politicians as kind of two-faced, as dishonest, untrustworthy, right? Because they're not speaking directly. They're sort of using all this highfalutin language, hiding things. Trump, meanwhile, comes out and just says the direct thing. He just says it. He just says, like immigrants are coming and raping people or whatever whatever it is. And now you might think, well, by the old model, it'd be like, well, this is going to be bad for him because sure, there's going to be some people who are like thumbs up to that, but there's going to be lots of people that are thumbs down. They're like, no, it's not true. But it turns out that there's enough people, or at least this is the hypothesis, who, even if they're not thumbs down or thumbs up, thumbs down to that, they see what him just sort of directly saying it as something, they take that as a sign of trustworthiness and honestness and honesty. And what's fascinating is that in the run up to the 2016 election, Trump, who is an inveterate liar, was seen by a majority of Americans as more trustworthy than Hillary Clinton. And this hypothesis of Stanley's could potentially explain that. It could explain that that's why, even though this guy's lying all the time, the fact that he just uses plain language makes him seem trustworthy. So I think that is, and I think to some extent, because now the entire Republican Party is captured by Trump, that he has completely inverted that whole sort of social norm thing. So now that if you go and use a lot of coded speech or things that are perceived to be coded, that is a mark against you because it's like, no, you're not speaking directly. And what we need is like somebody who just comes and says it directly how it is. So anyway, I think that is a potentially really interesting wrinkle in this sort of the kind of cultural shift that's been happening. Because remember, all this stuff goes back to way, way long ago. And I mean, there was already a kind of complaint about what was called the PC police or political correctness. That goes back to 90s, 80s, 70s, and there was like a whole TV show called Politically Incorrect in the 90s. And like, so this is all kind of, in some ways, we all kind of knew this is happening. And Trump, in a way, was like he kind of implicitly recognized that if you just violate all these rules outright, it turns out the costs of doing so aren't maybe as extreme, or maybe this was a moment where people were kind of, excited to have someone violate those rules.
Yeah, just a few days before the election this past November, he had that comedian come to one of his
Yeah,
rallies and call Puerto Rico like an island. He said, "I heard there's like an island of garbage in the ocean. I think it's called Puerto Rico,"
yeah,
and say that he said a lot of things about Mexicans and Mexican immigrants that I don't really want to repeat on this podcast. But like that was insanity. And but
yeah.
yet I think that the perhaps the real flaw is that liberals again and again were like, oh my God, well this time, oh like that's like just like being so aghast and offended by these things, and they are offensive. Like that's not to say that it's like not offensive, but not offensive to everyone and not offensive enough
Yeah.
or something. I don't know if there really could ever be something that would be offensive enough. I mean, like Trump's the Hollywood
Yeah.
Access tapes that were
Yeah.
released just a week before the 2016 election didn't change anything. Like
Yeah.
SNL was like calling it. SNL was like
Yeah.
was having a party. Yeah, it was yeah, and that wasn't even offensive enough. And that was like clearly bragging about sexually assaulting women. So
Yeah. Look, I think there's broader political headwinds that are contributing to this shift. And so when I mentioned the Stanley thing, that's kind of one hypothesis, but of course it raises a further question, which is, well, why now were people ready for kind of overt violations of these social norms to resonate right at that point? And I don't know the answer to that. So I think there's a lot of interesting political science and history that's going to be done in the next 20, 30 years to kind of explain all of the trends that got to this point. So yeah, and I don't know how that's going to go. So